So I've just recently finished reading Yanis Varoufakis' latest book, Technofeudalism, and it's a great title, but not a great book. Now, look, I get the sentiment that we're all feeling these days of being increasingly enmeshed in a new digital world order that chains us like serfs bonded to a virtual fiefdom from which we have no means to escape. A situation that the rise of AI is just going to make worse. That's why it's such a great title. But Varoufakis is claiming to offer more than just an evocative analogy. He's claiming that this is actually the correct mental framework with which to understand the political economy we live in today, and argues that it is a mistake to continue to see it as primarily being a capitalist economy. Technofeudalism, I claimed, is qualitatively distinct from capitalism, and thus, as a word, it illuminates crucial aspects of the real world in ways that rentier capitalism or platform capitalism or hypercapitalism cannot. And that's a big claim, and I don't find it convincing. But before I get to why, let me first explain his big idea. The overall framing of Varoufakis' book is that it is written as a letter to his late father, and the book starts with some touching anecdotes of how his father introduced him to the historical progression of our political economy. So let's also take a very brief and vastly simplified look at that history to capture the basic features and terminology of the three key eras that Varoufakis talks about: feudalism, then capitalism, and now technofeudalism. Under feudalism, a king grants land ownership rights and obligations to a collection of lords, who could then subdivide their land and pass on similar rights and obligations to vassals. Such a piece of land with its associated contractual rights and obligations was known as a fief, and it gave the vassal rights over all the people and produce generated within the bounds defined by their fief. Serfs were the people whose family was legally bound to the land of particular fiefs. And this is a crucial aspect of how feudalism worked. Serfs were not free people. Over the generations, their family inherited the obligation to work for whomever was the vassal of their fief. And the whole of the mini-society that existed within the context of a given fief was sometimes referred to as a fiefdom. The serfs worked the land and had to give a proportion of their produce and income to the vassal as rent, some of which was in turn passed further up the hierarchy. But some serfs could also sell some of their excess produce and crafted goods in local markets to generate a surplus income. And so there was also a growing market economy within which it was possible for some people to make a profit. However, in the political economy of feudal times, rents and the hierarchical power structures that supported them dominated any such profits. Then came along the capitalists. The capitalists used their accumulated wealth to build factories to produce goods that they could sell in the market for profit. They employed waged labour to operate their factories. This proletariat class of workers were no longer serfs bonded to the land, but were slightly more free in that they could choose who to work for. But especially with the enclosure of common land, the working class were effectively bound to the dynamics of the labour market in order to make a living. Over time, the feudal system collapsed in the sense that there were no longer any bonded serfs. The landowners still owned their land, but now they had to compete for labour to work their farms from the general labour market of free labourers. And of course, capitalism was boosted by the rise of the financial sector, such as banks and the stock market, which enabled capital wealth to be deployed more rapidly across the economy. And crucially for our purposes here, in this capitalist economy, profits came to completely dominate rents. But this was not just in terms of their relative size in the economy. The transition from feudalism to capitalism was, in essence, a shift of the power to command from landowners to owners of capital goods. Roll forward to today, and Varoufakis argues that that era of capitalism is over, as we've entered a new phase that he calls technofeudalism, as the power to command politics and society has shifted again, this time to the owners of what he calls cloud capital. So, under technofeudalism, rather than having vassals and their fief, we have cloudalists with their cloud capital. The well-known cloud fiefs of this system include companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple, And we, as consumers, are the new cloud serfs, bound to these various fiefs in ways that we cannot extricate ourselves from. If our whole social life is on Facebook, we can't just take it elsewhere. If we buy an iPhone, a cut of all our future in-app purchases goes to Apple. And every time we use these cloud technologies, they learn about our behaviors and subtly change our experiences on each platform to influence us to spend more time and more money within the particular cloud fief into which we've become enmeshed. And indeed, unlike the costly efforts required to sustain traditional capital, Varoufakis claims that cloud capital, in contrast, can reproduce itself in ways that involve no wage labour. How? By commanding almost the whole of humanity to chip into its reproduction for free. People writing tweets, building friendship networks, watching content, indeed making content like YouTube videos, all build the value of cloud capital and further train its AI algorithms to be better influencers of us all. We're helping to build the cloud fiefs to which we are bound. But furthermore, Varoufakis argues this power of the new cloudalists to command extends over the capitalists who are now similarly bound to use platforms like Amazon in order to sell their products. And just like vassals paying rent to their overlord, the vassal capitalists have to pay substantial rent to the cloudalists for the privilege of operating in their cloud fiefdom. The workers are now cloud proles who have every facet of their workplace monitored and coordinated by the same cloud technologies, giving the cloudalists even more influence over the economy and requiring the capitalist vassals to pay even more rent to the cloudalist class. But notice that even the richest cloudalist, like everyone else, is sometimes in the role of being a cloud serf. And Varoufakis has another whole thread that relates to the way that financialization and the response of the central banks to the financial crash and then the COVID pandemic means that companies building cloud capital often don't seem to care about generating profits, but would rather grow the scale of their fiefdom from which they can generate ongoing rents. Looked at in totality, it becomes apparent that the world economy is lubricated less and less with profit and increasingly with cloud rent. And indeed, this sense that rents are once again dominating over profits is the most persuasive part of Varoufakis' claim that we're back to feudal-like times. This all sounds plausible, so easy to nod your head along to. So why am I not convinced? I think we can see where this analogy breaks down if we scratch just a little bit at the idea that Amazon.com is a new kind of cloud fiefdom. And to be clear, this is not a defense of Amazon's monopolistic, predatory corporate behavior. I'm just not convinced by Varoufakis' claim that the best way to understand what's going on here is that we've entered an entirely new political economic era. For example, Varoufakis argues that Amazon uses its cloud algorithms through devices like their Alexa assistant to influence you, to shape your desires for which products to buy. Alexa trains us to train it better. Before long, it is training us to train it, to train us, to train it, to train us, ad infinitum. This infinite loop, or regress, allows Alexa and the great algorithmic network hiding in the cloud behind it to guide our behavior in ways superbly lucrative for its owner. This is the essence of algorithmic, cloud-based command capital. Really? I mean, I don't own an Alexa, but I do have Google Home Assistants, and at best the interactions with these assistants is very sporadic and transactional. And I don't imagine that there are many people spending hours engaging with the Amazon website, compared to sites and apps like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Those platforms really do draw in people's attention in ways that allow them to actually influence their thinking, which is why advertising on those platforms is so huge. So yeah, those social media platforms are the new media barons, but not Amazon. Sure, Amazon will nudge its customers a little here and there with book recommendations and other promotional offers. But despite being algorithmically boosted, this isn't that radically different from the way that traditional supermarkets and other retailers have promoted cross-selling and upselling for decades. Then Varoufakis notes that Amazon is not an open market where sellers and buyers can interact freely. When you look for, say, a toaster, Amazon controls which actual products it puts in front of you. But again, this is just as true for traditional supermarkets. If you drive to Walmart looking for a toaster, they have already pre-selected which few brands you'll be able to choose from. So yeah, Amazon is more like a supermarket than a village market, but just because it's online, that doesn't make it a new phenomenon, requiring a new way to understand the economic dynamics going on. And arguably, it was the bricks and mortar, large, out-of-town supermarket chains that did most to originally limit our choice of where to shop, as they made it so convenient to do all your shopping in one place that it decimated the variety of shops on the high street. That had nothing to do with cloud computing, but had a similar monopolistic style dynamic of dominating a market. Amazon's dominance of online retail doesn't come from it having a fancy website with clever cloud-based algorithms. It comes from its vast material infrastructure that allows it to offer cheap prices and extremely fast delivery of goods to customers. If it stopped doing this, people would soon shop elsewhere. Indeed, because with Amazon you are shopping online, it allows for much more competition in theory. In a different browser tab, you could go to walmart.com or maybe go to explore ebay.com to look for toasters and maybe find a different range of products and prices with different delivery options. It's much easier to jump from one website to another than it is to drive from shop to shop or town to town in the old days. There are even now websites and apps that will aggregate for you the range of different choices you have from different online retailers. And there are people who choose to cut Amazon out of their lives entirely, as they detest the way it treats its workers and suppliers. Now, having said that, there is an extraordinary statistic in Choke Point Capitalism about Amazon Prime's membership scheme. 1 in 2 American households are now members, and they're practically welded to the site. A recent study found just 1% of paid Prime members are likely to comparison shop elsewhere before making a purchase. That is huge market dominance. But Amazon hasn't entrapped us with a digital network effect like Facebook has. Our entrapment works through things like the psychology of having paid for delivery already, the brand confidence and sheer convenience of the quick deliveries from Amazon, plus the laziness of most of us not to just bother checking if anyone else is selling it cheaper and faster. These are all classic capitalist techniques for creating a moat through brand loyalty that protects a company from competition. So while algorithms and big data might help Amazon to do this more effectively, building such moats is not a new phenomenon. Indeed, similar scheming has been practiced by supermarkets and mail-order delivery companies for decades. So, as consumers, we may feel bound to Amazon, but we're only entrapped by tricks of the mind. Serfs were bound by law. Amazon's excessive power over suppliers is a different story, but again, it's not a new phenomenon. It's a classic distortion of a market when one or a few buyers dominate sellers. This situation is known as a monopsony, a complementary term to the more familiar situation of a monopoly. Again, supermarkets provide a non-tech example of monopsony-style market dynamics, when they, for example, squeeze the margins of milk producers whose main route to market is through the supermarket shelves. And indeed, through this monopsony power, the supermarkets take a significant cut of the final price of milk paid by the end customer. Middlemen taking an excessive markup has long been a form of rent-seeking behavior in capitalist markets. To quote again from Choke Point Capitalism, "We've seen it's supremely difficult to maintain the free conditions that are central to capitalism, since markets have such a strong natural tendency towards concentration, extraction, and rent-seeking. That's why ongoing interventions are needed, and why without them, we've ended up in another robber baron era." And notice that quote also ends with a nod to a feudal analogy. But it's in the context of this tendency being a well-known feature of capitalism that has been contended with since at least the 19th century, when the robber baron analogy was originally used. It's nothing new and nothing techno. So I've essentially been arguing that Varoufakis is trying to treat an evocative analogy as if it's a new political economic theory. And the gap between these two becomes even more apparent towards the end of the book, where his preferred techno-feudal analysis doesn't lead to any novel insights about what to actually do about the situation we're in. Indeed, worse than that, he expresses severe doubt that we'll find a route out of this situation through our existing democratic processes. On this new political stage, social democracy is impossible. We no longer have capital on the one side and labour on the other, allowing a social democratic government to play referee and force the two sides into a compromise. And even if they wanted to, Varoufakis doubts that governments would be able to tackle the monopolistic behaviours and economic power of the cloudalists, dismissing the possibility of effective regulation or of breaking up these cloud fiefdoms. But how does one break up Amazon, Facebook, PayPal, or indeed Tesla today? And, unlike national phone companies, which are national governments forced to charge the same rates when calling customers of competing companies, how can they force Twitter to share the backlog of all your tweets, photos and videos with, say, Mastodon? I find these stances surprising and unhelpful. Surprising because we saw during the COVID pandemic just how powerful the nation-state can be when it has the political will to act. And it's unhelpful because I think all progressives should be promoting democracy as a key part of the process for any such change. So why say that social democracy is impossible? In fact, he slightly contradicts his own suggestion that governments can't enact change, when at one point he says, "Indeed, the great irony from a Western perspective is that the only political force that can do anything to keep the cloudalists in check, and thus the hope of democracy alive, is the Chinese Communist Party." But China is hardly taking actions to protect the freedoms and autonomy of its citizens. So Varoufakis ends up sounding like he thinks it's only the Western democratic governments that can't or won't act to break up the monopolistic powers of these companies. And yet, for example, the EU have recently passed a law that is forcing Apple to allow other app stores on the iPhone. Also, the EU and the Federal Trade Commission in America are both separately investigating Amazon for anti-competitive behaviour, rightly accusing Amazon of abusing its position as both running the market and selling goods on the market. If found guilty, they both have the power to force Amazon to change this behaviour or face huge fines. Then there are the ongoing attempts by Australia and Canada to change the dynamics between Facebook and news media organisations. And yeah, there's the TikTok ban in America. Now, of course, the companies are pushing back on all of these moves, and the regulatory interventions may not all be sensible and may not work as intended, but they are examples that show that democratic Western governments can force companies to change the way that they behave within a market, and thereby reduce their feudal-like powers. And there are many other voices, like chokepoint capitalism, with many different suggestions for how governments could and should regulate these companies' behaviours more, and how societies should resist their attempts to lock us onto their platforms. But if you simply nodded along to Varoufakis' book, you would get the impression that such interventions are almost impossible to imagine in the West without a full-blown revolutionary overthrow of, well, capitalism. There are significant ways in which our political economy is changing, but technofeudalism doesn't capture them well. So while I was impressed by a different book by Varoufakis, And the Weak Suffer What They Must, which is well worth a read, I can't really recommend Technofeudalism. But have you read the book? What did you think of it? Am I being too harsh in my critique? Or indeed, what have I missed? Please do continue the discussion in the comments below, and subscribe to my channel for similar videos. Thank you for watching.